February 12, 1943, Baltimore, Maryland. When Vera Callahan first saw Chester Dunmore photographed with children for the Baltimore Herald, holding 3-year-old Dorothy Keane in his arms, the little girl wasn't crying from joy. She was crying from hunger. And the __quote_0___ smiled into the camera lens, his gold watch chain gleaming brighter than the tiny war bond pin on the child's threadbare sweater. The photographer, a young man with slicked back hair and a press badge tucked into his fedora, kept saying, "Hold still, sweetheart, just one more shot," while Dorothy's thin body trembled with sobs. Vera stood in the corner of the room, watching, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She wanted to run forward, snatch the child away from that man's arms, tell him to stop pretending he cared. But she was just a caretaker, nobody important, and Dunmore was Baltimore's industrial hero. Vera didn't know then that this photograph would become the first link in a chain that would, within 8 months, destroy the life of the most influential man in Baltimore's industrial district. She didn't know that little Dorothy would die from pneumonia 3 weeks later, not from cold, not from disease, but from malnutrition that left her body defenseless against infection. She didn't know that at the girl's funeral no one from the administration would attend, no director, no board members, no city officials who'd praised Dunmore's generosity in countless speeches, but she would be there. A 24-year-old caretaker who would swear over that tiny casket. Never again would a child die because someone decided to profit from children's empty bellies. The Riverside Children's Home sat on the outskirts of Baltimore's industrial waterfront, in a 3-story brick building that had once been a textile factory before the Depression shuttered it in 1932. The building still smelled of machine oil and old cotton dust, scents that no amount of lye soap could wash away. Gray walls, peeling paint, windows patched with newspaper against drafts, common enough for charitable institutions in wartime when every resource went to the war effort. The front entrance faced Cherry Street, where row houses leaned against each other like exhausted workers, their stoops crowded with women darning socks and old men smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. The back entrance opened onto an alley that ran between the home and a shuttered cannery, a space where cats fought over garbage, and children weren't supposed to play, but always did. But something was strange. Despite everyone in the neighborhood knowing about the generosity of Chester Dunmore, owner of Dunmore Meatpacking Company, the children at Riverside looked worse than those at neighboring homes where no benefactors ever visited. Mrs. Kowalski, who ran the corner grocery on Eastern Avenue, noticed it first. "Those Riverside children," she told Vera one Saturday morning when Vera stopped in to buy apples with coins she'd saved all week. __quote_4__. Vera had been working at the home for nearly 2 years. She'd arrived after graduating from the Baltimore Normal School in June 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor turned the world upside down. She was 23 then, born in April 1918 in a small Pennsylvania coal town called Carbondale, daughter of a miner named Thomas Callahan and a seamstress named Margaret. Her father had died in a mine collapse when Vera was 15, crushed under 3 tons of rock while trying to shore up a tunnel that the company knew was unstable, but hadn't bothered to fix because fixing things cost money. Her mother had worked her fingers to the bone, taking in alterations, sewing wedding dresses and christening gowns for women who barely acknowledged her existence, saving every penny to send Vera to normal school. __quote_5__. Her mother had told her on her 18th birthday, pressing an envelope with $47 into her hands, money that represented 2 years of squinting over needlework by candlelight, 2 years of skipped meals, 2 years of wearing the same dress until it fell apart. __quote_6__. Tall, thin, with short dark hair she cut herself with sewing shears to save money, and gray eyes that held stubborn determination inherited from her father, Vera sensed from her first days at Riverside that something was wrong. The children constantly asked for food. Not in the whining way spoiled children sometimes did, but with a desperate edge that made Vera's stomach turn. Little hands would tug at her skirt during story time, and small voices would whisper, "Miss Vera, when's supper?" even though supper was still hours away. "Miss Vera, can I have some bread?" even though breakfast had just ended. "Miss Vera, my tummy hurts," which was what the children said when they were too hungry to think about anything else. Portions were laughably small. Soups were watery, with rare chunks of potato floating in grease that formed rainbows on the surface like gasoline on puddles. Porridge was thin, without butter or milk, served in chipped bowls with bent spoons that the children had to share because there weren't enough to go around. Meat appeared once a week, and then only as strange patties where the meat was outnumbered by breadcrumbs and oats and something that tasted like sawdust. The children ate them anyway, eating so fast they barely chewed, shoving food into their mouths with both hands as if afraid it would disappear. The home's director, Mildred Hartwell, a heavy woman of about 50 with small eyes like raisins pressed into dough and permanently pursed lips that made her look like she'd been sucking on lemons, answered all complaints the same way. Quote, 10. She sat in her office on the second floor, a room that smelled of talcum powder and stale coffee, behind a desk piled with papers she never seemed to read. On the wall behind her hung a photograph of her shaking hands with Mayor Theodore McKeldin, both of them smiling at some charity function Vera had never heard about. Hartwell had worked in the Baltimore Orphanage system for 30 years, moving from home to home, always landing on her feet, always finding ways to make herself indispensable to the people who mattered. The supply clerk, Edna Pritchett, a dried-up old woman of about 60 with the yellow face of a chain smoker and fingers stained brown from nicotine, only smirked when staff asked why, after Dunmore's charitable visits, food supplies never seemed to increase. "Paperwork's in order," she'd say, waving a Lucky Strike cigarette like a conductor's baton. "Whatever you're imagining is your problem, not mine." She kept her office locked, a cramped room on the first floor next to the basement stairs, and she wore the key on a chain around her neck like it was a religious medal. Sometimes Vera would see her counting things in ledgers, her lips moving silently, her yellow fingers running down columns of numbers with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime making sure every penny was accounted for, at least on paper. Over 18 months, Vera had grown attached to the children, especially the little ones in the nursery group, ages 2 to 5, who still believed that adults would take care of them, who hadn't yet learned that the world was full of people who didn't care whether children lived or died. There was Dorothy Keane, a tiny girl with large brown eyes that seemed too big for her thin face, and blonde curls that Vera brushed every morning, trying to work the tangles out gently while Dorothy sat perfectly still, patient as a doll. Dorothy had been left at Baltimore City Hospital in winter 1940, wrapped in a flour sack with a note pinned to it that said only, ___, quote, __, 14 ___. The handwriting was shaky, probably a young mother, probably poor, probably desperate. The police had investigated, put notices in the newspapers, interviewed every young woman who'd given birth that winter at the charity ward, but Dorothy's mother was never found. Someone had speculated she might have been a girl from one of the row houses, maybe got in trouble with a boy who went off to the war, maybe had family who threw her out. But it was just speculation. The truth died with that anonymous note. The girl grew quiet, obedient, but always hungry. She didn't fuss or cry, didn't throw tantrums like some of the other children. She just held out her thin little arms to the caretaker and whispered, ___, quote, _15 ___, in a voice so soft you had to bend down to hear it. And Vera would secretly bring her bread from the dining hall, slipping it into her apron pocket during her own lunch, hide apples she bought with her meager $30 monthly salary, money that was supposed to cover her room at the boarding house, her food, her clothes, everything. But Vera wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, patched and repatched, darned at the elbows and hems, and she skipped meals herself so she could afford to buy fruit for Dorothy and the other children who looked at her with those hollow, hungry eyes. On February 1st, 1943, 2.5 weeks after that cursed photo session, little Dorothy came down with a fever. Vera was on night duty in the nursery, a long room on the 3rd floor with 20 small cots lined up in 2 rows, A room that was always too cold in winter because the radiators only worked on one side, and too hot in summer because the windows didn't open properly. The girl lay in her cot, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit with one missing ear, her only toy, something another child had thrown away but Dorothy treasured like gold. Her temperature climbed to 102. Vera sat beside her, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, watching the child's small chest rise and fall with labored breaths. At midnight, when Dorothy started coughing, deep, rattling coughs that shook her whole body and made the other children stir in their sleep, Vera called the doctor. Dr. Margaret Howell arrived 40 minutes later, a tired woman nearing retirement age who'd been the home's pediatrician for 12 years. She'd seen hundreds of sick children, delivered bad news to parents who couldn't afford medicine, signed death certificates for babies who died of things that could have been prevented if their mothers had eaten better during pregnancy, if they'd had warm houses and clean water and enough food. She examined Dorothy with efficient, practiced movements, listening to her chest with a stethoscope that was cold even though she'd warmed it in her hands, looking down her throat with a wooden tongue depressor, taking her temperature again. "Pneumonia," she said after the examination, her voice flat with the weariness of someone who delivered this diagnosis too many times. Vera said, standing up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor and woke two of the smaller children. __quote _19 Howell waved her hand wearily, already packing her stethoscope back into her black leather bag that was as old and worn as she was. Quote, 20, quote, 21, quote, 22. Dr. Howell cut her off, and her voice was kind but firm, the voice of someone who'd had this argument before and knew how it ended. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. The child has pneumonia. It's serious, but it's not critical yet. If the fever breaks by morning, she'll be fine. If it doesn't, I'll take her to the hospital myself in my car. But calling an ambulance in the middle of the night for every fever would bankrupt this place. The city only pays for emergency transport, and this isn't classified as an emergency yet. Do you understand?" Vera wanted to argue, wanted to scream that Dorothy was already too thin, too weak, that her body couldn't fight off an infection the way a healthy child's could, that waiting until morning might be too late. But Dr. Howell was the authority, the expert with 12 years of experience and a medical degree from Johns Hopkins, and Vera was just a caretaker with 2 years of normal school and 18 months on the job. So she nodded, got the aspirin from the medicine cabinet, a metal box with a red cross painted on it that contained a few bottles of pills and some bandages and not much else, and spent the night sponging Dorothy's burning skin with rubbing alcohol that made the room smell like a hospital, watching the little girl's chest rise and fall, counting the breaths, praying each one wouldn't be the last. But by morning, Dorothy was worse. She gasped for breath, wheezing with every inhalation, her lips turning blue like she'd been eating berries, her skin gray and damp with sweat, even though the room was cold. Her eyes were half open but unfocused, looking at nothing, seeing nothing. Vera shook her gently, called her name, but the girl didn't respond. At 6 o'clock, when the day shift arrived, two women, one old and one young, both looking tired before the day even started, Vera ran downstairs and called the hospital herself, screaming into the phone that a child was dying. "Please send an ambulance, please hurry." The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Two men in white coats carried Dorothy down the stairs on a stretcher that was too big for her small body, her arms flopping at her sides. Vera rode with them to Baltimore City Hospital, sitting in the back of the ambulance that smelled of disinfectant and old blood, holding Dorothy's hand, whispering to her that everything would be all right, that she'd be back soon, that Miss Vera would visit every day and bring her a new toy. But Dorothy didn't respond. She just lay there, her breathing getting shallower, her skin getting grayer, her pulse getting weaker under Vera's fingers. 3 days later, on February 4th, at 3:17 in the afternoon, Vera was in the middle of reading a story to the other children, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which was Dorothy's favorite even though she wasn't there to hear it, when someone knocked on the nursery door. It was Helen Novak, one of the nurses, a young woman with kind eyes who always had candy in her pockets for the children. But today, her face was pale, her eyes red. "Vera," she said quietly, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind her so the children wouldn't hear. __quote, _26 __. Vera knew before Helen said a word. She'd known since that morning when she'd woken up with a feeling like ice water in her stomach, a premonition she couldn't explain. She'd known when she'd gone through the motions of washing her face, getting dressed, eating breakfast she couldn't taste. She'd known, but she'd been hoping she was wrong. Quote 27, quote. She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Helen nodded, tears already running down her face. Quote 28, quote. The rest of the words disappeared into static. Vera stood there in the hallway, the sounds of children playing in the nursery behind her, the sounds of the city outside, cars honking, people shouting, a radio somewhere playing Glenn Miller, life going on like nothing had happened, and she felt something inside her crack like ice on a frozen lake. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry. She just stood there, numb, while Helen talked about arrangements and paperwork, and did she want to see the body before they took it to the morgue? That evening, after her shift ended at 6, Vera went to the hospital and asked to see the medical chart. The nurse at the desk, a middle-aged woman with glasses and a suspicious expression, tried to say no. Medical records were confidential. Only family members could see them, and orphans didn't have family. But Vera stood there, silent and immovable as a stone, her gray eyes fixed on the nurse's face, until the woman gave in and brought her the file. Cause of death: bilateral pneumonia, complicated by second-degree malnutrition and chronic undernourishment. The medical chart recorded measurements that made Vera's vision blur. Height: 35 inches, normal for age. Weight: 22 pounds, severely underweight, 6 to 8 pounds below normal range. Temperature on admission: 104 degrees. White blood cell count: critically low. Prognosis: poor from the start due to weakened immune system and lack of body fat reserves to sustain through illness. At the bottom, someone, probably Dr. Howell, had written in neat handwriting, patient showed signs of chronic undernourishment, including muscle wasting, poor skin condition, brittle hair, and delayed growth markers. Body unable to mount effective immune response to bacterial infection. With proper nutrition over previous months, survival probability would have been significantly higher. As presented, patient had minimal chance of recovery. Normal weight for a 3-year-old was 28 to 30 pounds. Dorothy had weighed 22. 6 to 8 pounds underweight. That was the difference between life and death. 6 pounds of meat and milk and vegetables that should have fed her, but instead had gone into someone's pocket, someone's bank account, someone's mansion on Charles Street. Dorothy Keane's funeral took place February 7, 1943, at Greenmount Cemetery. On a day so cold, the gravediggers had to use pickaxes to break through the frozen ground. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds that threatened snow but hadn't delivered yet. 7 people attended. Vera, 2 other nursery staff, Louise Brennan, a soft-spoken woman from West Virginia who'd lost her own daughter to scarlet fever 10 years ago and still wore black on the anniversary, and Rita Kowalski, a young Polish girl who'd come to America in 1938, fleeing things she wouldn't talk about, and still spoke English with an accent that got thicker when she was upset. There was Josephine Shaw, the cleaning woman, a black woman in her 60s who'd worked at Riverside for 25 years and remembered when the building was still a factory, when she'd worked there as a girl operating a loom for 12 hours a day. There was Helen Novak, the nurse who delivered the news, who stood with her hands clasped and tears running down her face. And there were 2 older children who'd been friends with the little girl. 6-year-old Walter Briggs, who'd shared his bread with Dorothy at lunch every day, who stood now with his small face frozen in an expression too old for his years. And 5-year-old Anna Petrova, a Russian girl whose parents had died in a tenement fire, who'd let Dorothy play with her only doll, and who now clutched that doll to her chest and sobbed. Director Hartwell sent a wreath with a ribbon reading, "From the staff of Riverside Home." The wreath was small, cheap. Carnations dyed pink that would wilt within a day, probably cost $3 at most. She didn't attend herself, sent word through her secretary that she had a meeting with the city welfare board that couldn't be rescheduled, something about budget allocations and staffing ratios. The board members probably didn't even know there was a funeral. Probably didn't know Dorothy had existed. Probably wouldn't have cared if they did. The coffin was small, white, cheap pine that would rot within a year and collapse into the earth. The funeral director, a thin man named Mr. Peterson, who did discount services for orphanages and paupers, had explained apologetically that this was what the home's budget allowed. $8 for a child's funeral, including the coffin, transportation, and burial plot. Quote 31 he'd said, looking embarrassed, adjusting his worn black suit that had seen too many cheap funerals. But with the war, costs are up, and wood is expensive, and the cemetery charges what they charge. I'm sorry we can't do better. Dorothy was buried in the section for wards of the state, a corner of the cemetery where the city buried children who had no family to claim them, children who died in orphanages or hospitals or the streets, children whose lives had been so short and unremarkable that no one would remember them except the people who'd loved them. 8 other small wooden crosses already stood there, tilting at angles, their names barely legible after years of rain and snow and neglect. The oldest was 12 years old, a boy named Timothy Chen, who died in 1931, during the worst of the Depression, probably of starvation, though the death certificate said, quote, 33, quote. The newest, before Dorothy, was a girl named Sarah Washington, who died just 4 months ago in October 1942. Cause of death, tuberculosis. Age, 5. Weight, 28 pounds, which should have been normal but wasn't when you considered she should have weighed closer to 40. Vera stood at the grave watching workers shovel frozen earth over the white casket, listening to the sound of dirt and stones hitting wood, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years. Something inside her broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way ice breaks on a pond in spring. She remembered how Dorothy had asked for bread at bedtime, her small voice barely a whisper in the dark dormitory where 20 children slept in narrow cots. How she'd stretched out those thin little arms and whispered, "Miss Vera, I'm so hungry. My tummy hurts." How Vera had hidden a piece of her lunch bread in her pocket to give the girl, still warm from being pressed against her body. How Dorothy had eaten it greedily, quickly, choking a little, clutching the bread to her chest with both hands as if afraid someone would take it away, crumbs falling onto her nightgown. How she'd looked up at Vera with those big brown eyes and said, quote, 35 words that Vera could still hear in her head, clear as a bell. And now this was the result. A small white cross on a small grave. A marker with her name carved by some city worker who probably carved a dozen names a year, children reduced to dates and numbers. Quote 36 __. 3 years of life. 3 years of hunger. 3 years of waiting for someone to love her, to feed her, to keep her safe. And she died anyway. Died because someone decided that money was more important than her life, that profit mattered more than a child's empty stomach, that wealth was worth more than breath. That evening, Vera sat in her boarding house room on Greenmount Avenue, a tiny third-floor room with a single bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a chair with one wobbly leg, and a window that looked out over the alley where neighborhood kids played stickball in summer and built forts out of snow in winter. She could hear Mrs. Henderson downstairs listening to the radio, Fibber McGee and Molly, the canned laughter echoing up through the floorboards. She could hear the Andrews sisters singing, quote 37, quote, hear people laughing like the world was normal, like children didn't die of hunger in the richest country on earth, like everything was fine. The city slept under blackout regulations, streetlights painted over with black paint, windows covered with heavy curtains, air raid wardens walking the streets making sure no light showed that might guide enemy bombers. Everyone knew the Germans would never bomb Baltimore, would never make it across the Atlantic, that the blackout was just practice, just being careful. But you followed the rules anyway, because that's what you did during wartime. You followed orders. You did what you were told. You didn't ask questions. Somewhere out there, in his mansion on Charles Street in the Mount Vernon neighborhood where the rich people lived in houses with marble steps and brass door knockers, slept Chester Dunmore, 50-year-old industrial magnate, holder of 2 civic commendations from the mayor and a letter of appreciation from the War Department, philanthropist and benefactor. His house had 12 rooms, a staff of 4 including a cook and a maid and a gardener. Gardens that a full-time gardener tended even though most people had turned their gardens into victory gardens to grow vegetables for the war effort. His wife, Elizabeth Dunmore, wore fur coats and went to charity luncheons where women ate finger sandwiches with the crusts cut off and talked about helping the poor while sipping tea from china cups. His 2 sons were at Yale, studying business and economics, destined to take over the meatpacking empire their father had built. Young men who'd gotten draft deferments because their father's company was essential to the war effort. His portrait hung in the home's foyer, next to a poster of FDR looking stern and determined, and another poster urging people to buy war bonds with the slogan, quote, 38, quote. In the photo, Dunmore was shaking hands with Mayor McKeldin, both men smiling, both wearing expensive suits that cost more than Vera made in a year. On his desk at home, probably, sat a copy of the Baltimore Herald with that photograph of him holding Dorothy, looking like a saint, like someone who cared about orphans, like a man doing his civic duty. And children were dying of hunger. Vera opened a 5-cent notepad she'd bought at Woolworth's and began to write. Dates, facts, observations. She decided she would collect evidence. Systematically, methodically, the way she'd been taught in her documentation class at normal school by Professor Morrison, a stern woman who drilled into her students that facts mattered, that documentation was the difference between accusations and proof, that in a court of law or the court of public opinion, you needed evidence that couldn't be disputed, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be dismissed. She started with what she knew for certain. Dorothy Keane, born winter 1940, died February 4, 1943. Cause of death, bilateral pneumonia complicated by malnutrition. Weight, 22 pounds, 6 to 8 pounds underweight. She added the names of the other children who died since she'd been working at Riverside. Sarah Washington, age 5, died October 1942, tuberculosis. Michael Flynn, age 4, died December 1941, whooping cough complicated by malnutrition. Ruth Cohen, age 6, died March 1942, influenza. Each one underweight. Each one too weak to fight off infections that healthy children survived. She wrote down her observations about the food. Soup, watery. 3 pieces of potato average per bowl. Grease floating on surface. Porridge thin, no butter, no milk, sweetened with brown sugar to hide taste. Meat rare, once per week. Strange taste suggesting heavy use of filler. Portions small, children always hungry, asking for food between meals. Children eating too fast, hoarding food in pockets, hiding bread under pillows. She wrote down dates she could remember when Dunmore's truck had delivered food, but the meals hadn't improved. Tuesday, January 12th. Friday, January 15th. Tuesday, January 19th. The pattern going back months, maybe years. Deliveries coming in, food not reaching the children. Where was it going? Who was taking it? How much money was involved? She wrote until her hand cramped, until the candle she'd lit. Candles were cheaper than electric light and she was trying to save money, burned down to a stub, until her eyes ached from straining in the dim light. And when she finally put down her pen at nearly midnight, she made a promise to Dorothy's memory. This stops now. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, however much it costs her personally, she would find out what was happening to the food meant for those children, and she would make the people responsible pay. Not just lose their jobs, not just get reprimanded. Pay. Really pay. Prison. Public shame. The destruction of their comfortable lives, the way they destroyed Dorothy's life, and the lives of all the other children who died because someone wanted more money. The next hook appeared 3 days later, and Vera almost missed it. On Tuesday, February 10th, a truck from Dunmore Meatpacking arrived at the home. It was exactly 10:15 in the morning. Vera checked the clock in the hallway, an old thing with a cracked face that ran 5 minutes slow but still worked well enough to mark time. Vera happened to be in the courtyard, escorting the older children out for their morning exercise. Director Hartwell insisted on exercise, said it kept the children healthy and built character, though Vera thought it was probably just to get them out of the building so the staff could have a break from the constant noise and questions and needs. It was a cold morning, 20 degrees according to the thermometer outside the kitchen window, the kind of cold that hurt your lungs when you breathed, that made your nose run and your fingers ache even inside gloves. The children were bundled in hand-me-down coats that were too big or too small, never quite right, and patched mittens that let the cold through at the fingers where the wool had worn thin. Gregory Henderson, a 7-year-old boy with a cowlick that wouldn't stay down no matter how much water you put on it, was complaining that his fingers hurt, that he wanted to go back inside. Walter Briggs, who'd been at Dorothy's funeral, wasn't complaining about anything. He'd barely spoken since Dorothy died. He just walked beside Vera, his small hand in hers, holding on tight like he was afraid she might disappear too. A Ford stake truck, white with Dunmore Meatpacking Company painted on the side in red letters that were starting to peel, pulled through the gate and stopped at the service entrance. The truck's engine coughed and sputtered. Needed a tune-up, probably. But mechanics were hard to find with so many men overseas fighting in Europe and the Pacific. 2 men in stained coveralls climbed out. One was tall and thin with a scarred face that looked like he'd been in a knife fight, his left cheek marked with a white line that ran from his ear to his mouth. The other was short and stocky with a pronounced limp, favoring his right leg like it pained him. Both wore rubber boots caked with blood and sawdust from the meatpacking plant, and they moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this route 100 times. Supply clerk Pritchett rushed from the building, moving faster than Vera had ever seen her move, waving papers in one hand and a cigarette in the other. She wasn't wearing a coat, even though it was freezing, and Vera could see her breath making clouds in the air that mixed with the cigarette smoke. "Hurry it up, I don't have all day," she shouted, shivering, rubbing her free arm with the hand holding the cigarette, ash falling onto her sleeve. "I've got 3 other deliveries to sign for this morning, and the board meeting at 11. Vera slowed the group of 12 children, pretending to fix Gregory's scarf, taking her time with the knot, watching the truck out of the corner of her eye while appearing to focus on the child. The men opened the truck's rear gate with a metal clang that echoed in the courtyard and startled a cat that had been sleeping under the stairs. Inside stood wooden crates, standard meatpacking containers about 2 feet square, with stamps and labels that Vera couldn't read from where she stood, but that looked official, governmental. Pritchett set her cigarette on the edge of the truck's bumper, careful not to let it fall because tobacco was rationed, expensive, hard to get, and looked into one crate, her yellow face pinched with concentration. She reached in with one hand, pulled out something wrapped in brown paper, squeezed it like she was testing fruit at the market, nodded with satisfaction. The men began unloading, grunting with the effort, their breath making clouds that hung in the cold air. Vera managed to count. 8 crates, each about 2 feet square, fairly heavy judging by how the men handled them. They lifted together, one on each side, bending their knees the way you were supposed to lift heavy things to save your back. When they set the crates on the dolly, Vera could hear the wood creaking under the weight, could see the dolly's wheels dig into the ground. Then Pritchett signed something on a clipboard, retrieving her cigarette and taking a long drag, the tip glowing orange. The men drove off with a backfire that made 2 of the smaller children jump and grab Vera's skirt, and the crates were wheeled on the dolly into the basement where the food storage was located, disappearing through a heavy metal door that clanged shut behind them. Nothing unusual, it seemed. A routine delivery, the kind that happened all the time. Food coming in to feed 60 children and 20 staff members, the machinery of institutional care grinding along. But that evening, when the children ate supper at 6 o'clock in the dining hall, A long room with tables that had been scarred by generations of children carving their initials into the wood when the staff wasn't looking. Vera noticed. The tables held the same thin soup with 3 pieces of potato floating in grease that had cooled and congealed into white lumps, and porridge without butter, served with a sprinkling of brown sugar that was probably meant to hide how tasteless it was. No meat. Dinner was as meager as always. The children ate in silence, hunched over their bowls, eating quickly because meals were timed, and if you didn't finish in 20 minutes, your food was taken away whether you were done or not. Vera watched a 5-year-old girl named Ruth Cohen try to make her portion last by taking tiny sips of soup, tiny bites of bread, stretching it out because she knew there wouldn't be more, that this was it until breakfast tomorrow. She watched Walter Briggs wipe his bowl with bread, getting every last drop, then lick his spoon clean, his tongue reaching into the bowl's curve to catch any remaining soup. She watched Anna Petrova slip a piece of her bread into her pocket, saving it for later, for when the hunger got too bad in the middle of the night and she couldn't sleep. After the children were dismissed to their evening activities, an hour of supervised play before bed, the older ones playing checkers or card games, the younger ones playing with the few worn toys the home possessed, Vera approached the cook, Martha Doyle, a heavy woman of about 55 with a red face from standing over hot stoves for 30 years, and hands scarred from burns and cuts, the occupational hazards of institutional cooking. Doyle had worked at the home for 20 years, since 1923, had seen directors come and go, had served thousands of meals to thousands of children, most of whose names she'd forgotten but whose faces sometimes came back to her in dreams. __quote _42 __, Vera said quietly, pulling her aside near the kitchen door so the children wouldn't hear. They brought meat this morning. 8 crates. I saw it myself. Why aren't you cooking with it? Doyle looked at her like she was crazy, her eyebrows rising toward her hairline, her face creasing with confusion. What meat? Nothing was delivered to us. Last delivery was last Wednesday, February 3rd. 8 crates of ground beef, mostly fat, but I made it work. Made those patties the kids hate, but at least it's protein. That's all we've had this week. But I saw it myself. 8 crates from Dunmore Meatpacking. White Ford truck, 2 workers, one with a scar on his face. This morning at 10:15. Pritchett signed for it. I counted the crates. Don't know what you saw, girl. The cook wiped her hands on her greasy apron, a gesture Vera had seen her make 1,000 times, an automatic movement when she was thinking or worried. But nothing came to my kitchen. I keep records, see? She pulled a notebook from her apron pocket, a small spiral notebook with grease stains on the cover and pages curled from moisture, and showed Vera pages of careful handwriting documenting every delivery, every item, every meal prepared. Last entry is February 3rd. 8 crates ground beef, used in meat patties February 5th. Nothing since then. You want to know what came to the kitchen, you ask me. I know everything that comes through that door, because I'm the one who has to cook it. But deliveries go through Pritchett first, down in the basement storage, and what Pritchett does with them before they get to me, that's her business. I just cook what I'm given. Vera felt her stomach tighten. So food comes to the building but doesn't make it to the kitchen? I didn't say that, Doyle said quickly, looking nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I'm saying I only know what I receive. If there's other deliveries I don't know about, that's between you and Pritchett. I don't want trouble. I've got 10 years until my pension, and I'm not risking it asking questions. Vera went to Pritchett. The clerk sat in her small office on the first floor, a cramped room next to the storage basement that smelled of cigarette smoke and mildew, with filing cabinets lining every wall, and a desk piled with papers and ledgers, and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. She was smoking a Lucky Strike and reading a movie magazine, Photoplay, with Rita Hayworth on the cover, her red hair carefully curled, her smile promising escape from wartime drabness into a world of glamour and romance. A cup of coffee sat on the desk, still steaming. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute most people drank, which meant Pritchett had access to the black market or knew someone who did. Miss Pritchett, Vera said from the doorway, not entering without permission because Pritchett was territorial about her space. Meat was delivered this morning. Why isn't it on the supper menu? Pritchett slowly raised her yellow eyes from the magazine, squinted through smoke that curled from the cigarette dangling from her lips. She didn't speak for a moment, just stared at Vera with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted during something important, someone who didn't appreciate questions from subordinates. Pritchett said slowly, taking the cigarette from her mouth and tapping ash into a tray already overflowing with butts. Quote, 57. She nodded toward the exit with her cigarette, dismissing Vera like she was a child who'd asked a stupid question. Vera stood there for a moment longer, anger rising in her throat like bile, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But she swallowed it down. Anger wouldn't help. Accusations without proof wouldn't help. Pritchett would just report her to Hartwell, and Hartwell would fire her, and then she'd be gone, and the children would still be starving, and nothing would change. She needed to be smart about this, needed to think like Professor Morrison had taught her. Document, observe, gather evidence, build a case that couldn't be refuted, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of some girl who didn't know how things worked. She returned to her room that night and wrote in her notebook, __quote _58 __. She started a new page with questions. Where does the meat go after Pritchett signs for it? Who takes it out of the building? How is this covered in the accounting books? How long has this been going on? How much money are they stealing? Who else knows? How high does this go? Does Hartwell know? Does Dunmore know? Is this organized or opportunistic? Over the next 2 weeks, Vera began watching more carefully, adjusting her schedule, volunteering for duties that would put her near the courtyard or the service entrance. She noticed a pattern, one so regular you could set your watch by it. Every Tuesday and Friday at 10:15 a.m., give or take 5 minutes depending on traffic, the Dunmore truck arrived. Always the same 2 workers. She started thinking of them as Scar and Limp, not knowing their real names, identifying them by their physical characteristics. Always 8 crates, always the same size, presumably the same contents, though she couldn't be certain without opening them. Always signed for by Pritchett, who always came out without a coat no matter how cold it was, who always had a cigarette, who always seemed irritated by the interruption of her morning routine. And never, not once, did meat appear on the children's plates on Tuesday or Friday evenings. Vera checked the menus posted in the kitchen, handwritten by Martha Doyle in her careful script. Tuesday, February 16th. Vegetable soup, carrots, onions, celery, and water. Bread, white, 1 slice per child. Applesauce, canned, sweetened. Friday, February 19. Bean soup, navy beans with ham hock for flavor. Cornbread, made with cornmeal and lard. Stewed tomatoes, canned. Tuesday, February 23rd. Potato soup, potatoes, onions, water. Bread, canned peaches, 1 peach half per child. No meat, even though deliveries had come each of those mornings, even though 8 crates of meat should have provided enough protein to feed the children properly for a week. On February 24th, after 2 weeks of observation, Vera decided to take a risk. That Tuesday evening, after the children were in bed at 8 o'clock and the night shift had taken over, a rotation of 2 staff members who sat in the hallway between the boys' dormitory and the girls' dormitory and dealt with nightmares, bedwetting, sickness, fights, the normal difficulties of 60 children trying to sleep in crowded rooms, she crept down to the basement. It was 9:30 p.m., late enough that most of the staff had gone home or to their rooms, early enough that people might still be working, finishing up paperwork, doing inventory. The storage room was in the basement, down a set of concrete stairs that were steep and uneven, the kind of stairs where you had to hold the railing or risk falling. The hallway leading to the storage room was dark. Bulbs had been removed to save electricity for the war effort, and the darkness was thick and complete. The kind of darkness where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Vera had to feel her way along the wall, counting doors by touch. The furnace room, the laundry room, the janitor's closet, until she found the storage room at the end of the hall. Light seeped from underneath the storage room door, a yellow stripe that cut through the darkness. Vera's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, could feel it shaking her whole body, could taste it metallic in her mouth. Her hands were sweating despite the cold, and she wiped them on her dress, took a deep breath, and approached the door. The door stood ajar, maybe 6 inches open, enough for her to peek through without being seen if she was careful. She positioned herself to the side, looked through the crack. Pritchett was inside, but she wasn't alone. Director Hartwell was there too, wearing the same dark blue dress she'd worn all day, her hair coming loose from its pins, looking tired and irritable. And a third person, a man Vera didn't recognize. Short, balding, maybe 40 years old, in an expensive wool coat that looked custom-tailored. The kind of coat that cost more than Vera made in 6 months, with leather gloves tucked into one pocket. They stood among the metal shelves lined with canned goods and sacks of flour and sugar, talking in low voices that echoed slightly in the concrete-walled room. "Next pickup is Friday night," the stranger was saying. His voice was educated, careful. The voice of someone who'd gone to good schools and knew how to talk to important people, how to modulate his tone to sound reasonable and trustworthy. Hartwell said, her voice taking on a defensive tone, the tone of someone who'd been criticized unfairly. "No problems in 3 years, Mr. Keller. 3 years of smooth operation, not one single issue, not one complaint or investigation or awkward question." So the stranger had a name. Keller. Vera filed it away in her memory, wished she had paper to write it down, but she didn't dare move to pull out her notebook. __, quote _ 63 __. Keller continued, pulling off his gloves and tucking them more carefully into his pocket. Pritchett said firmly, lighting another cigarette even though one was already burning in an ashtray on a shelf, her yellow fingers shaking slightly. Hartwell said, and Vera could hear the irritation in her voice, could picture her pursing her lips the way she did when annoyed. Quote 69, quote 70, Keller said, and he laughed, a dry sound without humor, like paper rustling. Quote 71, quote. They all laughed at that, all 3 of them, and the sound made Vera feel sick, made her stomach turn, made her want to burst through that door and scream at them, claw at their faces, hurt them the way they were hurting the children. But she held herself still, forced herself to keep watching, to keep listening, to gather information. Quote 72, Keller asked, pulling out a small notebook and a pencil. Quote 73, Pritchett said. Quote 74. Quote 75, Keller calculated, writing in his notebook. __, quote _ 76 __. Vera did the math in her head. They were stealing $600 worth of meat per week, over $2,400 per month, nearly $30,000 per year. Money that could have fed the children properly, kept them healthy, kept them alive. Pritchett said. They dispersed, Hartwell heading toward the stairs, Keller toward the back exit, Pritchett staying behind to lock up. Vera waited until the footsteps faded, until she was sure they were gone, then backed away carefully, quietly, counting her steps in the darkness, not breathing normally until she was back in her room with the door locked and a chair wedged under the doorknob. Her hands shook as she wrote in her notebook, writing fast, trying to capture every word she could remember. __, quote _ 82 __. She sat on her narrow bed thinking. She had evidence now, eyewitness testimony, names, amounts, dates, a pattern. But would it be enough? A good lawyer could argue she'd misheard, misunderstood, made it up. She needed more. She needed photographs, documents, something physical that couldn't be explained away. She needed to catch them in the act. Convenking of Friday, February 26, 1943. The Midnight Operation. Vera volunteered for the night shift again, telling the supervisor, a tired woman named Mrs. Cooper who was just grateful someone wanted to work Friday nights, that she couldn't sleep anyway, that she might as well make herself useful. At 10:30 p.m., she positioned herself in a second-floor storage closet that had a small window overlooking the rear courtyard. She'd borrowed a Brownie camera from Rita Kowalski, claiming she wanted to take pictures of the children for a scrapbook project, something to cheer them up after Dorothy's death. Rita had been happy to lend it, even gave her 2 rolls of film. Vera had bought 2 more rolls at Woolworth for 20 cents, spending money she couldn't afford to spend, but this was too important. She set up her position carefully, opened the window just a crack for a clear shot, positioned herself where she could see the gate and the service door, checked the camera to make sure she knew how to operate it. Her hands were shaking. Whether from cold or fear, she wasn't sure. At 10:55 p.m., a black Packard sedan pulled up to the rear gate, its headlights off, moving slowly and quietly. The gate opened from inside. Someone had unlocked it in advance. The Packard drove into the courtyard and parked near the service entrance. 3 men got out. One was Keller, the balding man from the conversation she'd overheard. The other 2 were new, dock workers judging by their clothes, rough-looking men in longshoremen's jackets and flat caps. They opened the car's trunk, waiting. At exactly 11 p.m., Vera checked her watch, a cheap Timex that had been her mother's. The service door opened. Pritchett emerged, followed by 2 men Vera recognized as maintenance workers. Otto Schmidt, a German immigrant who did carpentry and repairs, and Louis Garner, the boiler operator, both in their 50s. They carried wooden crates from the basement, the same crates that had been delivered that Tuesday. The dock workers began loading them into the Packard's trunk and back seat. It was tight work. 8 crates didn't fit easily, but they managed. Vera photographed everything, her hands trembling but forcing herself to hold steady. Click. The license plate of the Packard, clear and readable. Click. Keller's face as he supervised the loading. Click. Pritchett handing something to Keller, papers of some kind. Click. Keller handing an envelope to Pritchett, the exchange of money. Click. Schmidt and Garner loading the crates. Click. The filled Packard ready to drive away. Every shot careful, documented. Evidence. The whole operation took 12 minutes. At 11:15 p.m., the Packard drove away, its headlights still off until it reached the street. Pritchett and the maintenance men went back inside. The courtyard was empty again, dark and silent. Vera stayed in her hiding spot for another hour, making sure no one came back, making sure she hadn't been seen. Then she crept downstairs, returned the storage closet to its normal state, went back to her room, hid the camera under her mattress where she kept her most precious things. The next morning, Saturday, she took the streetcar to a pharmacy on Eastern Avenue, far from the home's neighborhood where no one would recognize her. The clerk, a teenage boy with acne, barely looked at her as she handed over the film and paid $1.50, half a week's salary, money that should have gone for food or rent. He said the pictures would be ready Tuesday. Tuesday felt like a year away. Vera went through the motions, caring for the children, reading stories, serving meals, changing diapers, all the routine tasks that made up her days. But her mind was elsewhere. What if the pictures didn't come out? What if they were too dark? What if the license plate wasn't readable? What if she'd wasted her money and her one chance? On March 2nd, she picked up the photographs. The clerk handed her an envelope. She paid another 50 cents for the prints, and she didn't look at them until she was back on the streetcar, her hands shaking as she opened the envelope. They were perfect, clear, sharp, damning. The license plate was readable, Maryland 4B7723. Keller's face was recognizable. The cash exchange was visible. You could see the envelope passing from his hand to Pritchett's. The crates with Dunmore Meatpacking stamps were unmistakable. Schmidt and Garner's faces were clear. This was evidence. Real, physical, undeniable evidence. But Vera knew it wasn't enough yet. A good lawyer could argue this was a legitimate business transaction, that she'd misunderstood what she was seeing. She needed the other half, the paper trail, the forged ration stamps, the falsified delivery records, the doctored account books that showed meat coming in but not going to the kitchen. Those documents were in Hartwell's office and Pritchett's files. She spent the next week studying the building's routines more carefully than ever. Hartwell left her office unlocked only during the lunch hour, 12 to 1 p.m., when she went to the staff dining room on the second floor. She was predictable in her habits, creatures of routine. Pritchett's office was locked all the time, but Vera noticed she kept the key on a ring attached to her belt. On Wednesday afternoons, Pritchett took her 15-minute break in the staff lounge at 2:15 p.m., hung her coat on the rack, and the key ring was in the coat pocket. On Wednesday, March 10th, Vera made her move. At 2:10 p.m., she positioned herself near the staff lounge, pretending to read a bulletin board about upcoming events. At 2:15 p.m., Pritchett arrived, hung her coat on the rack, went to the coffee pot. Vera waited until Pritchett's back was turned, slipped her hand into the coat pocket, found the key ring. 4 keys. She had no idea which opened what. She'd have to try them all. She walked quickly to Pritchett's office, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the building must be able to hear it. The hallway was empty. Everyone was outside for the children's afternoon recreation hour. She tried the first key. Wrong. Second key. Wrong. Third key. The lock turned. She was in. The office was cramped, filing cabinets against every wall, the desk piled with papers and ledgers. Vera didn't have much time, maybe 15 minutes before Pritchett's break ended. She started with the cabinet labeled Deliveries 1943, pulling drawers open, flipping through files. Her hands were sweating, making the papers stick to her fingers. There, Dunmore Meatpacking. She pulled out the January and February folders. Every Tuesday and Friday, 8 crates, 40 pounds per crate, signed for by E. Pritchett. But the carbon copies, the ones that should have gone to the kitchen, weren't there. Only the white top copies. That meant the cook never got confirmation of deliveries. The meat was being diverted before it even reached the kitchen paperwork. She kept searching, aware of time passing, aware that every second increased her risk. Found another file cabinet. __quote _84 __. Opened it. Inside were sheets of unused ration stamps, red stamps for meat, blue stamps for processed foods. But these looked wrong. The paper was slightly different, the printing slightly off. She'd seen enough real ration stamps to know these were forgeries, probably from that printer in Philadelphia Keller had mentioned. She pulled out Rita's camera, photographed everything. The delivery invoices showing meat coming in, the missing carbon copies, the forged ration stamps, the ledgers showing one set of numbers for the city auditors and another set, hidden in a folder marked __quote _85 __, showing the real transactions. Page after page, working as fast as she could, her hands shaking, sweat running down her back despite the cold room. 15 minutes. 20. She was pushing her luck dangerously. She closed the files, locked the cabinet, relocked the office door, her hands so sweaty she nearly dropped the keys. She walked back to the staff lounge, her legs shaking. Pritchett was still there, drinking coffee, talking to another staff member about some movie she'd seen. Vera slipped the keys back into the coat pocket, retreated before she was noticed. Back in her room, she could barely breathe. She'd done it. She had the complete chain of evidence now. Photographs of the midnight pickup, photographs of forged ration stamps, photographs of falsified delivery records, photographs of doctored account books. A clear trail from Dunmore's company to the home staff to the black market distributors. This was federal crime territory. Ration fraud during wartime. The Office of Price Administration prosecuted these cases aggressively. The FBI got involved when organized black market operations were uncovered. But she still needed one more piece to make the case ironclad. Witness testimony. Someone inside the operation who would talk, who would confirm what the documents showed, who would testify in court if it came to that. She thought about the maintenance men, Schmidt and Garner. They weren't the masterminds, just workers following orders for a few extra dollars. They were vulnerable, might talk if confronted properly. On March 15th, Vera approached Louis Garner. She found him in the boiler room at 7 a.m., shoveling coal into the furnace that heated the building. He was a thin man, maybe 55, with a caved-in chest and the hacking cough of someone who'd spent too many years breathing coal dust and cigarette smoke. His wife had died 5 years ago of cancer. He had an elderly mother living with him who needed expensive medicine. He worked for $35 a month and could barely make ends meet. __quote _86 ___, Vera said, closing the boiler room door behind her so they wouldn't be overheard. Can I talk to you about something important? He looked up from the coal, suspicious. What about? About what you're doing on Friday nights. At 11 o'clock, in the courtyard, loading crates into a Packard sedan. His face went white. The shovel clattered to the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the small room. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Mr. Garner. I saw you. I have photographs. You and Otto Schmidt loading crates of meat into a black Packard, license plate Maryland 4B7723. Meat that's supposed to feed the children here. Instead, it's going to black market dealers, and Chester Dunmore is getting rich while kids like Dorothy Keane starve to death. Garner backed against the wall, his breath coming in short gasps, his hand over his chest like his heart was bothering him. You can't prove nothing. It's your word against... I can prove everything, Vera interrupted, pulling the envelope of photographs from her apron pocket. She showed him. The Packard, the loading, his face clear as day. I have pictures. I have documents from Pritchett's files showing forged ration stamps and falsified records. I have delivery logs. I have testimony. The only question now is whether you go down with Hartwell and Dunmore and spend the next 20 years in federal prison, or whether you help me stop this and maybe save yourself. They'll kill me, Garner whispered, his voice cracking. If I talk, they'll kill me. You don't know these people, miss. They're connected. Dunmore knows people. He's got lawyers, politicians, police on his payroll. You think you can fight that? You're just a girl. They'll destroy you. Maybe, Vera said quietly, putting the photographs away. But I made a promise to a little girl who died in my arms. Her name was Dorothy Keane. She was 3 years old. She weighed 22 pounds. She died because the food that should have fed her was being sold on the black market for profit. I promised her I'd stop this. I don't care what happens to me, but I need you to decide what kind of man you are. The kind who lets children starve so he can make a few extra dollars? Or the kind who does the right thing even when it's hard? Garner slumped to the floor, put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. Vera thought he might be crying. I needed the money, he said finally, his voice muffled. My mother's got cancer. The medicine costs $40 a month. Medicare doesn't cover it all. I only make $35 here. I was going to lose the house, lose everything. Pritchett offered me $10 every Friday to load some trucks. Said it was surplus food, excess inventory, perfectly legal. I knew it wasn't. I knew. But I needed the money. My mother was dying. What was I supposed to do? I understand, Vera said, and she meant it. She understood desperation, understood impossible choices, understood what poverty could make people do. But children are dying too. Dorothy Keane was 3 years old. She weighed 22 pounds. She died because the meat that should have fed her was being sold for profit. How many more have to die before you do the right thing? What do you want me to do? Write down everything you know. Names, dates, amounts, how long this has been going on, who else is involved, where the meat goes, how much money changes hands. Everything. And then we take it to someone who can't be bought off, someone who will actually do something about it. And then what happens to me? I don't know, Vera admitted. You'll probably face charges. But if you cooperate, if you testify, the prosecutors might give you leniency. Maybe suspended sentence, probation. Maybe you serve a year or two instead of 20. I can't promise anything. But I can promise that if you don't help me, this continues. More children die. And eventually, it gets exposed anyway, and you go down with everyone else. Garner looked up at her, his eyes red, his face haggard. How do I know you won't just turn me in anyway? Because I'm not interested in punishing workers who are desperate for money. I'm interested in stopping the people at the top. Dunmore, Hartwell, Pritchett, Keller, the ones making real money off this. You help me get them, and I'll do everything I can to help you. He thought about it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. God help me, I'll do it. Over the next 3 days, Lewis Garner wrote his statement. 4 pages, handwritten on lined paper in careful script, detailing 3 years of systematic theft. The operation had started in February 1940, just after Dunmore became the home's official supplier through a city contract his lobbyist had helped arrange. At first it was small, 1 or 2 crates a week, test runs to see if anyone noticed. Nobody did, so it grew. By 1941, they were diverting half the meat deliveries. By 1943, they were diverting 80%. The money was split exactly as Vera had overheard. Dunmore took 50%, Hartwell 30%, Pritchett 10%, Keller and his distribution network 10%. The workers, Schmidt and Garner, each got $10 per week for their labor and their silence. Garner estimated that over 3 years, the operation had stolen approximately $75,000 worth of rationed meat, equivalent to over $1.5 million in future value. Meanwhile, 12 children at Riverside Home had died from malnutrition-related illnesses since 1940. Dorothy Keane, Sarah Washington, Michael Flynn, Ruth Cohen, Thomas O'Brien, Elizabeth Santos, William Chen, Mary Kowalski, Joseph Alvarez, Anna Petrova, James Murphy, Robert Jackson. 12 names. 12 small graves in the Ward of State section at Greenmount Cemetery. Vera read Garner's statement sitting in her room at midnight on March 19, 1943. She had everything now. Photographs, documents, witness testimony, a complete case. But who could she take it to? The police? They might be compromised. Dunmore had connections throughout the city. The mayor's office? They owed Dunmore favors for his war bond contributions and employment of city workers. The City Welfare Board? Hartwell sat on that board. Then she remembered Frank Delaney, an investigative reporter for the Baltimore Sun, mid-30s, known for his exposés on defense contractor fraud and black market operations. He'd written a series of articles the previous year about a construction company that was using substandard materials in military housing, pocketing the difference. The company had sued him for libel. He'd won. The company executives went to prison. If anyone would run with this story, it was Delaney. On March 20th, 1943, Vera called the Baltimore Sun from a payphone on the street, using precious nickels she couldn't afford to spend. Quote, there was a pause. Quote, clicks, transfers. Then a man's voice, gravelly from too many cigarettes. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, my name is Vera Callahan. I work at Riverside Children's Home. I have evidence of black market ration fraud, child endangerment, and criminal conspiracy involving one of Baltimore's leading industrialists, city officials, and an organized distribution network. Are you interested? Another pause. What kind of evidence? Photographs of midnight pickups, forged ration stamps, falsified delivery records, doctored account books, witness testimony from someone inside the operation, a complete paper trail from the supplier to the home to the black market buyers. Who's the industrialist? Chester Dunmore, owner of Dunmore Meatpacking. A low whistle. That's a big accusation. I have proof. Can you meet me tonight? There's a diner on North Avenue, O'Malley's, 9 o'clock. I'll be there. Vera spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous terror, wondering if she was making a huge mistake, if Delaney was trustworthy, if this would blow up in her face. But she'd come too far to stop now. At 8:45 p.m., she took the streetcar to North Avenue, walked 3 blocks to O'Malley's Diner, a tired-looking place with cracked vinyl booths and a counter where men in work clothes ate meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Delaney was waiting in a back booth, a thin man with sharp eyes and nicotine-stained fingers. He stood when she approached. Quote, 124, quote, 125. They sat. Vera brought out everything. The photographs, the documents she'd copied on stolen carbon paper, Garner's testimony, her own detailed notes. Delaney spent 2 hours going through it all, asking questions, taking his own notes in a reporter's shorthand she couldn't read. When he finished, he looked at her with something between respect and concern. Vera said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. Delaney studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Quote, 129. Quote, 130. Quote, 131. That week was the longest of Vera's life. She went through the motions at work, caring for children, attending staff meetings, smiling at Hartwell and Pritchett, while her heart pounded every time they looked at her. Every time someone knocked on her door, she thought, they know, they're coming for me. But nothing happened. The routine continued. Tuesday delivery, Friday pickup. The machinery grinding on, children going hungry, money changing hands. On Sunday, March 28, 1943, the Baltimore Sun ran Frank Delaney's story on the front page, above the fold, with a banner headline in 72-point type. Black market meat ring exposed. Prominent industrialist accused of starving orphans for profit. The article was devastating, methodical, unassailable. Names: Chester Dunmore, Mildred Hartwell, Edna Pritchett, Raymond Keller. Dates: operation running since February 1940. Amounts: $75,000 in stolen meat over 3 years. Photographs: the midnight loading, the cash exchange, the forged stamps. Testimony: Lewis Garner's complete statement. The death toll: 12 children with their names, ages, and causes of death listed. By noon on March 28th, FBI agents were at Dunmore Meatpacking seizing records. By evening, Hartwell and Pritchett were in custody, arrested at the home in front of horrified staff and children. By Monday morning, Chester Dunmore was under arrest at his mansion, dragged out in handcuffs while his wife screamed and neighbors watched from their porches. The trial began in May 1943 in Baltimore Circuit Court, federal prosecutors from the Office of Price Administration handling the case. The charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, ration stamp forgery, theft of government property, child endangerment, criminal profiteering during wartime. The evidence was overwhelming. Delaney's article had barely scratched the surface. The FBI had found ledgers, correspondence, bank records showing exactly where the money went. The jury, 12 Baltimore citizens, 8 men and 4 women, deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Chester Dunmore was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and fined $100,000, a fortune at the time. Mildred Hartwell got 10 years. Edna Pritchett got 7. Raymond Keller got 12. Otto Schmidt and Lewis Garner, who testified for the prosecution, received suspended sentences and probation, the judge noting that they'd been exploited by the others, that their cooperation had been essential to the case. Vera Callahan became briefly famous. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Brave caretaker exposes war profiteer. She was interviewed on radio programs, received letters from strangers thanking her for her courage, from mothers who said they'd sleep better knowing someone was protecting vulnerable children. But Vera hated the attention. She'd done what needed doing, nothing more. The city appointed a new director for Riverside Home, Grace Patterson, a competent, honest woman who'd run a children's hospital in Philadelphia. Food supplies were immediately audited and regularized. Within 2 months, the children were eating properly for the first time in 3 years. Meat appeared regularly on the menus. Portions increased. The hollow look began to fade from the children's faces. But the victory came with costs Vera hadn't fully anticipated. Death threats arrived. Anonymous letters shoved under her door saying she'd pay for what she'd done, that she'd destroyed a good man, that she was a troublemaker who needed to be taught a lesson. Late-night phone calls with breathing on the other end, sometimes whispered threats. Once, someone threw a brick through her boarding house window with a note attached. __quote_134___. The police investigated but found nothing. The detectives were sympathetic but useless. Quote, 135, they said. Quote, 136. But Vera knew better. These were Dunmore's associates, people whose black market operations had been disrupted, people who'd lost money and feared exposure. They were sending a message. In June 1943, Vera requested a transfer. She couldn't stay at Riverside. Every time she walked past Hartwell's empty office or saw a meat delivery truck, she remembered. The City Welfare Board sent her to a smaller children's home in Annapolis, quieter, safer, away from Baltimore's industrial district. She worked there for 2 years, keeping her head down, doing her job well but without fanfare. The threats eventually stopped. Life returned to something approaching normal, though Vera never felt entirely safe, always looked over her shoulder, always checked under her car before starting it. In 1945, when the war ended and the men came home, Vera left institutional work altogether. She married Arthur Brennan, a Navy machinist's mate who'd served in the Pacific aboard a destroyer, a quiet man with kind eyes who'd seen too much death and understood why Vera sometimes woke screaming from nightmares. They moved to a small house in Catonsville, had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, lived a quiet suburban life. Vera never forgot Dorothy Keane or the others, but she tried to move forward, to build something good. Chester Dunmore served 8 years of his 15-year sentence before dying of a massive heart attack in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in August 1951. He was 58 years old. His obituary in the Baltimore papers was brief, factual, stripped of the honorifics and praise that had once accompanied his name. No mention of philanthropy or civic contributions, just the facts. Chester Dunmore died in federal custody, convicted war profiteer, survived by no immediate family. His wife Elizabeth had divorced him in 1944, reclaiming her maiden name, moving to New York to escape the scandal. His sons had changed their surnames legally, one becoming Douglas and the other Morrison, anything to distance themselves from their father's disgrace. Neither attended his funeral. He was buried in a pauper's grave in a prison cemetery outside Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. 3 people attended the service: a prison chaplain who'd never met him, and 2 gravediggers who were paid to fill in the hole. No flowers, no mourners, no tears. Mildred Hartwell was released in 1951 after serving 8 years with good behavior. She moved to Florida, worked as a clerk in a hardware store in Tampa, told people she'd been a teacher up north. She died alone in 1963 in a small apartment that smelled of mothballs and disappointment. Edna Pritchett served her full 7 years, was released in 1950, and disappeared from public records. Raymond Keller served 10 years, was released in 1953, and died in a car accident in 1957, drunk, alone, on a rural highway outside Pittsburgh. Riverside Children's Home, Baltimore, Maryland, September 1968. Vera Brennan, now 50 years old, stood in the foyer of Riverside Home, looking at a memorial plaque that had been installed in 1945, after the convictions, after the new administration took over. It was bronze, mounted on the wall opposite the entrance, impossible to miss. It read, ___quote__139___. Vera had been invited back for the home's 50th anniversary celebration. The current director, Janet Morrison, a young, energetic woman who'd read Vera's story in journalism school and been inspired to enter social work, had asked her to speak to the current staff and children. Standing before 60 children and 20 staff members in the assembly hall, the same room where she'd once read stories to Dorothy Keane, Vera spoke quietly but clearly, her voice carrying. __, quote, _, 140 __. What I learned is this: evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it wears a nice suit and smiles for photographs. Sometimes it donates to charity and shakes hands with mayors. Sometimes it has a gold watch and speaks about civic duty and sacrifice while children starve behind closed doors. The only way to recognize it is to watch what it does, not what it says. Watch whether children are fed or hungry. Watch whether the powerless are protected or exploited. Watch whether money flows toward care or toward pockets. Watch whether the vulnerable are cherished or discarded. And if you see something wrong, document it carefully. Find allies you can trust. Build your case methodically, and don't stop until it's fixed. Because one honest person, armed with evidence and courage and an unshakable commitment to justice, can change the world. I did. You can too. The children applauded, some because they understood, some because they were told to, but a few with genuine feeling, especially the older ones who'd heard the story before. A 14-year-old girl named Patricia Lewis raised her hand. Miss Brennan, were you ever sorry you did it? Did you ever wish you just kept quiet and stayed safe? Every time I was scared, and I was terrified constantly. Yes, part of me wished I'd never started. Part of me wanted to walk away, find another job, pretend I'd never seen anything. But then I'd remember Dorothy Keane's face, how she looked at me with those big eyes and whispered, "I'm hungry, Miss Vera." How she died weighing 22 pounds, lighter than most babies. How she'd trusted me to keep her safe and I'd failed her. And I'd know I had to see it through. Because her life mattered. All their lives mattered. And someone had to stand up for them. Someone had to say, "This is wrong, and it stops now." This is what it should have always been, what you made possible. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, sweetheart, but I saved all the ones who came after. I'll keep their memory alive as long as I live. That's my promise, my oath, my life's work. Then she walked out into the September sunshine, back to her car, back to her quiet life as wife, mother, grandmother, former caretaker who'd once changed the world. Those 12 names were carved into her heart deeper than bronze, permanent as bone. And whenever anyone asked her about courage, about justice, about whether one person could make a difference, she told them Dorothy's story. And the story lived on.